Good evening, everyone. My name is Bob Taylor. I'm the library manager for the West Virginia Archives and History Library. I'd like to welcome everyone to our Archives and History lecture series. We have a great program for tonight. Before we get started, I would like to let you know that we have a great series of lectures already lined up for 2014. For those of you who entered, there was this big red sheet of paper out there that has all of our next year's, well, a few of our next year's lecture series presenters. And I hope you pick up one before you leave if you didn't get one. You can check out our website for these upcoming lectures as well. If you're not on our email list and wish to receive announcements of our upcoming lectures, we have a sign-up sheet here at the front desk and one out in the Great Hall. For the lecture this evening, we have Dr. Billy Joe Peyton. His presentation will be History of Charleston, the Modern Era. Dr. Peyton received his Ph.D. in History from West Virginia University. Among his many accomplishments, he has worked as a public historian at WSWP-TV in Beckley and for the National Park Service in Mississippi and West Virginia. In 2002, he joined the faculty at West Virginia State University. He has been active in preservation efforts, and his work as a writer and historian on several documentary films, including Ghost of Greenbottom, which is a winner of a 2005 Bronze Telly Award. He also may be seen in the 50 States series that airs on the History Channel. In 2010, he authored a local history book titled Charleston Then and Now, and currently has a second book scheduled to be released in December titled Charleston, the First 224 Years. If this book is out in time, it would be a great present for the holidays. Well, I would like you to join me in making welcome Dr. Billy Joe Peyton.
Thank you very much, Bobby. I just wanted to add that if you have not heard Mr. Taylor play a fiddle, he plays a mean fiddle.
Better than I talk.
No, not at all. And I want to thank my friends here at Archives and History for allowing me to come back for a return engagement. I gave a precursor to this talk, I think it was in March of this year, and ran out of time. So I told Joe Geiger and the other folks here, Randy and Bobby, that I could come back and do more if they would have me, and so here I am. And I want to continue now with what I'm calling the modern era, which basically will be the century between 1900 and the turn of the 21st century. A lot happened in Charleston over that intervening 100 years. A lot of history has affected the city, its growth, ultimately its downsizing in the last half of the 20th century. A lot of the buildings that we still see are survivors of the early history. We have a lot of new history that I'll try to get to most everything tonight. The presentation is kind of a hodgepodge of events, activities, some interesting side notes and tidbits of history based on bigger events that happened, and I'll tell you the rest of the story on some of these things. I want to set the stage for where we are in 1900 in Charleston. Charleston would become the permanent state capital in 1885. We had been the capital for a brief period in the 1870s, and then the capital was stolen from us, taken back to Wheeling. And my buddy who used to work here, Brian Ward would argue that Charleston stole the capital from Wheeling. But Brian's not here anymore, so it's okay, I can say that. This is the 1885 Capitol, a beautiful Victorian structure that stood, guess where? On Capitol Street. Exactly, right? Yep. In that block between Lee Street and Washington Street, Dickinson and Capitol. That building and the return of the Capitol here really started the boom in Charleston and the growth of the city. Also, Charleston became a railroad town combined with a river town and a capital city and a county seat, all rolled into one, roughly the same time. The C&O Railroad arrived in 1873, and it originally went from Richmond to Huntington. Later on expanded in the 1880s and beyond to Cincinnati and Newport News on both ends. So that means it went from the Atlantic coast to the Ohio Valley, and then from Cincinnati on to Toledo, the Great Lakes markets, and Chicago by the early 20th century. And generally speaking, the old C&O line is now CSX property, CSX right-of-way. Another railroad that followed on the heels of the C&O was the Kanawha, Michigan, which arrived in the early 1880s, and it originally went from Charleston to Point Pleasant, or the other way, Point Pleasant to Charleston. So it connected the Kanawha Valley with the Ohio Valley, and then it was expanded under the ownership of the New York Central Railway in the early 20th century, eventually made it all the way to the Great Lakes as well, to Toledo and Chicago, and that was really the boom area for that railroad. Later on, that became Conrail, those of you who remember the Consolidated Rail Network, rail system, and now it's affiliated with the Norfolk Southern. And those are the two depots from the two main railroads. The one on the left, of course, still survives at the base of the Southside Bridge. Unfortunately, the K&M depot is now a pier for the interstate, right next to Capitol Market. The Capitol Market was the freight depot for the K&M, and later on the New York Central. This is a map, a little bit hard to distinguish on the big screen, but most of those lines that you see, if they're not rivers, they are railroads. And the point here is that Charleston was a rail hub by the early 20th century, with coal coming out of the area, passenger trains, something like 12 passenger trains a day came into Charleston on the New York Central system alone. The C&O also had passenger service, but it was mainly a coal hauling railroad. That's where they really made their money and staked their claim. Charleston would get interurban lines in the last couple of decades of the 19th century, and following suit with other cities around the country by the turn of the 20th century, our streetcars, which originally were pulled by horses on rails, were electrified, the line was expanded, and by World War I, the interurban line ran from Cabin Creek, east of Charleston, to St. Albans. You could run continuously pretty much the whole length of the valley and the county. The car barns that you see there, part of them still exist. Those barns were built as the barns for the streetcars in roughly about 1905, and today they still stand on Virginia Street East, and that's where Goodwill Industries is. And the way you really wouldn't recognize them, except you can still see 3 of the 4 pointed towers still stand. But part of them were demolished when Goodwill improved the facility a few years ago. Now that adds also to the attraction of Charleston, and the fact that I always tell my students that Charleston was a normal, mid-sized American city in the early 20th century. With the coming of industry, this also contributes to Charleston's rapid growth around World War I. Charleston would be anchored on both ends by 2 large plants. On the upstream end, and actually it's the second plant, let me go ahead and start with the first one, so we'll do it chronologically. The first major industrial facility within city limits. There were factories all around Charleston, of course coal mining going on in the surrounding area. Charleston was a banking center as well. The Kelly Axe and Tool Company, reputed to be the largest axe company and implement company in the world, started in 1905 on Patrick Street. And today it's where the Patrick Street Plaza is, everything from Burt Wolf Ford to Kmart and Big Lots and everything else in that general vicinity was once upon a time the Kelly Axe plant. In my lifetime and most of your lifetime, you remember it as a True Temper plant. It employed at its peak over 1,000 workers, making up to 40,000 implements a day and being shipped all over the world. When that opened in 1905, it really began the development of the lower west side, the flat area of the west side. If you go to that area today between Canal Boulevard and Washington Street and probably Delaware Avenue and Patrick Street, you'll see a lot of modest working class homes in that area. And those homes, a lot of them were built for the workers at this plant and for the railroad also, which arrived on the west side in the 1880s. The K&M and then the New York Central bisected the west side, and a lot of small plants and warehouses were built right along the railroad. And that also bolstered the population of the west side. Now, on the other end of town, conveniently, within a decade of the Kelly Axe plant we get two important glass plants. One was the Libby Owens Ford plate glass plant, which was one of the first, if not the first, factory to be built by the newly combined Edward Libby and Michael Owens company of Libby Owens, later become Libby Owens Ford. And a lot of you are old enough to remember when every automobile window was made by Libby Owens Ford practically, and had a little LOF sticker on the windows. Probably a good chance some of that glass was made right here. The Libby Owens Ford glass plant was built on the south side in what today is Canal City, right where the shops at Canal are today, or the old Canal Mall are located. Directly across the street, now McCorkle Avenue, within a year, Michael Owens opened a bottle works, and that was the Owens bottling plant. And Michael Owens is an interesting guy because he was a Mason County native who invented a bottle making machine that you see right there behind him, and that's actually Owens looking at one of his bottles. That bottle making machine revolutionized bottle making, or the bottle machine, revolutionized bottle making. And this bottling works next to the glass plant combined employed over 700 workers, probably closer to 1,000 in their heyday. And the upper end of Canal City, the residential neighborhoods around where the plants used to be, owe their existence mainly to these plants as well. So it's interesting that both ends of the city have large manufacturing facilities, and then the city fills in between them over the intervening 60 or 70 years. And I can always remember as a kid coming back from my uncle's house. He lived in Glen Ferris, and I always thought that was, you might as well be driving to New York or something, because it was so long to me. But I can always tell when we were home, when we rounded the bend on Route 60, and you could see the smokestacks for the Libby Owens plant. And you can see the smokestacks. Is there a pointer on this? I'm afraid if I hit the wrong button, it doesn't look like it. You can see the smokestacks. At one point there were 12 of them, and unfortunately they were demolished along with the two plants. I think there's still one building maybe left of the Owens bottling plant, tucked in behind Lowe's and Cracker Barrel, and there's an office complex there now. But you'll also notice that the closing dates for both the glass plants and actually the Libby Owens plant and the axe factory, they were within 2 years of each other when they closed in the early 80s. So that was a 1-2 blow to the city's economic fortunes when we were already experiencing some problems. Now, as the 20th century unfolds, if you look at the population of Charleston, we're still a village in the 1870s and 1880s, and really it's not until 1900 and then 1910, 1920, through the war years, the population would expand greatly and rapidly in the 10-year census period that you see here. At one point, our population exceeded 85,000, in 1960, and optimistic estimates said that Charleston would certainly top a 100,000 population within a very short period of time. We never made it, and in fact now our population is barely 50,000. Another very important event to the history of the city, which happened in the early 20th century, is the Great Capitol Fire in 1921. It changed the face of Charleston because it moved the Capitol from the heart of downtown on Capitol Street. It made way for construction of what was, for many, many decades, the tallest building in West Virginia, and that's the old Canal Valley building, which I cannot get used to calling it the SunTrust building. It's still the Canal Valley building. To me, I used to work in there when it was Canal Valley Bank, which morphed into One Valley Bank and then became BB&T today. But that is the corner where the old Capitol was, and that fire resulted in the Capitol being moved to its present location right next door. A decision was consciously made. There were discussions of leaving the Capitol somewhere in the city or relocating it on a hill outside town. I think the Southside was another possible location. But the final location selected for the state capitol was the site on which the complex we're in now stands. And a lot of people don't realize it, but this was a residential neighborhood at the time. Just like the East End, all the streets around us, imagine that's what this looked like, and that's exactly what it looked like. There are several streets that have disappeared as a result of building the Capitol here as well. Our Capitol, I happen to think, is the most beautiful state capitol. Now, I haven't seen all 50 yet, but it would be hard to pass ours in beauty for a number of reasons. And our Capitol Dome is 5 feet taller than the U.S. Capitol Dome, which is also a very interesting sidelight. A side story that I will tell, my wife and I just adopted a brother and sister from Haiti last year. They had no knowledge of the outside world, and it's taken us over a year to explain to them the difference between our capital and the nation's capital in Washington, because when they see a picture of the nation's capital, they think it's our capital, and it's really kind of hard to get them to understand the difference between the two. We're still trying to get that through to them. Now, right next door, and just in front here on Canal Boulevard, is our lovely governor's mansion. After the fire in 1921, when the decision was made to begin moving everything here, construction started in 1924 and 25 on our mansion, which was designed by a local architect, Walter Martens, who went on to design many, many apartment buildings in Charleston and surrounding area. He also designed Torkelstone, Governor McCorkle's son's residence in South Hills, and the Women's Club on the west side at the corner of Elizabeth and Virginia Street. He also did a number of churches in the area. One story is that Cass Gilbert, when he saw the design, he was very pleased with it. And in fact, Gilbert had actually sketched out his idea for what our executive mansion should look like, and it was the same basic design. And of course, Cass Gilbert designed our Capitol. He was a world-class architect, and again, second to none, so we hired the best architect to build our Capitol. And he had commissions that included a number of other state capitals, the U.S. Supreme Court building, the Woolworth building, which when built was the tallest building in probably the world for a short time. And this was Gilbert's last commission before he passed away. The Capitol itself was built in 3 different phases: the east wing, west wing, and then the center dome, rotunda, was built last. In 1932, construction was complete, and state offices and the governor's office all moved here. Actually, they were forced to move in 1927 when the temporary Capitol also burned, which was across the street from the old Victorian Capitol on Capitol Street. I put the slide on the upper right there for you. This is a great day-night view of the Capitol Dome. Since the gold has been redone on the dome a few years ago, depending on the light conditions on the dome, it changes color miraculously. It's amazing, and I see it because I live about a block and a half from here, and I'm walking or running by here almost every day. Depending on how the sun shines on it, or if it's nighttime, it goes from the gold and the grayish black paint to sometimes looking all black, sometimes looking all gold, and sometimes actually looking silver, as you see in that nighttime shot. It's hard to make out the detail, but the photo at the bottom is the landscaped area on the north side of the Capitol where the fountain is. And in fact, that circle is the fountain that's about to be complete in the 1940s. There's also a replica of the Liberty Bell back there, if you ever look at it closely. And I put this up here to show you that if you look back there on Washington Street, there are still a lot of houses, and this was in the 1940s, that still bordered the Capitol. They've all since disappeared for more state buildings. These are two sheets from Sanborn maps. And Sanborn maps are fire insurance maps that historians use, and the archives has a collection of them here, which I've used many times. They are fire insurance maps, and they're done for cities all over the United States at various times. And Charleston had its first Sanborn done in the 1880s, and they were redone periodically in the 1890s, the early 1900s, and in 1933. The one on the left is the same area where the Capitol is that you see on the right. And I know you can't make out a lot of detail, but you see the Capitol, the U-shaped Capitol there. And you can tell in 1912 there was not much here. There were some building lots and some new houses, but by the time the Capitol was built in the 20s, that area had pretty much filled in. And the one on the right is 1933 sheet. The Sanborns can give you remarkable information about a city. Now, one of the interesting aspects of building our capital, we like to think that we are living in an era where people tend to think green and be environmentally conscious, but when the Capitol was built, people also recycled. They recycled buildings in this case. And the neighborhood that was here, about 50 houses were condemned on this site to build the Capitol. When they were condemned, a bunch of owners decided to move their houses. And they moved them downriver, some went upriver, they went to a variety of locations in the valley. There were apparently 12 houses left on their original sites. And a local developer, two developers, Brad Noyes and A.E. Young, created a development across the river in South Ruffner called Beachview, and it was called Beachview because the local bathing beach was nearby on Lick Branch. Beachview, you can see the bathing beach from the lots. They divided their property into lots, purchased the 12 remaining houses from the company that was hired to move the other houses. They were already here, and that company was John Eichley Company out of Pittsburgh, and they were expert house movers. They had moved houses and buildings and statues all over the eastern U.S., and this was no big deal for them to move a few small houses. I say small, they were not that small, but to them it was a manageable job. The total cost that the developers had to pay to get those houses to their new site across the river was $42,000 or $3,500 per house. And there was a clause in the contract that said if Eichley did any damage to any of the houses, they would have to pay for the damages. And apparently they paid nothing. There was nothing paid out because nothing was damaged in the move. Some houses left their furniture in place, and I've read where some china was left in cabinets, and they were so delicate with the move that they moved everything without damaging anything. It's pretty amazing. Today, at least 3 of those houses still stand in South Ruffner on 20th Street, and I'll show you them in a minute. But those are houses being moved. On the bottom slide, you can barely make out, just about in the middle where the two hills come together, there's a house on a barge that's about to be offloaded on the south side at the site of the development. There are some houses being moved. And this is actually Ickley describing the move. They got considerable publicity for this job, and there were articles in a number of magazines about the actual project itself. And Ickley was pretty confident about the work. It was no big deal to him, and he explained how they did it. They brought down barges from Pittsburgh, where they're from, hitched them together. With a wooden barge between them, they built a trestle work, false work under the houses, and with cross pilings and trusses and crib block, essentially, from the curb of what was then Kanawha Street, which was very high above the riverbank, and then loaded the houses on that, and then brought them down to river level on the barges and moved them across, and then did the same thing on the other side. And he closed out by saying the job was a large one because of the number of houses, but it wasn't an especially difficult one. They have a great website that actually shows these houses being moved for the Ickley Corporation now. Ickley is still in business in California, but they no longer move houses. They've gone into different directions. One of the projects Ickley did before this one, they actually moved a telephone exchange building, I think in Indiana, with the operator still in the building working. They connected an umbilical cord and kept all the utilities connected. The operators continued answering phones, and they moved the building several hundred feet, and they turned it around. Again, no big deal. Those are the two houses on 20th Street. The map, that's another Sanborn page. This is actually the 1933 Sanborn I showed you earlier from the other side of the ruver. And if you ever wonder how South Ruffner got its name, as near as I can figure, it got its name because it was directly across the river on the south side from the Ruffner family holdings. And the original name of the streets in the South Ruffner neighborhood were all south with the same name as the streets on this side. There was South Elizabeth, let's see if I can point it out, South Elizabeth right here, South Greenbrier, and then Kanawha Avenue was South Kanawha. So those names are a mirror image of what was over here on this side. Now, since many of the streets have changed names, not Kanawha Avenue, but some of the others. And today, there were a lot more of those houses still standing, I think, until a few years ago. And Triana Field, which is the baseball field for UC, their parking lot now would be to the left of where you see I have the blocks around the two houses that you see here, which are still standing. There's at least one more that I know of, and probably one or two more that may be hiding in there somewhere. By the 1930s, which is the era we're now entering, Charleston had become notorious for traffic jams. If you've ever been to Morgantown, you know what a real traffic jam is in a small town. Charleston, if you look here, the red routes were all U.S. highways, and the numbers will be familiar to a lot of you. The blue lines are state routes, and if you'll notice, they all converge on Charleston, and most of them go right down Washington Street. And that was a big reason that Charleston was congested. People who lived in the city reported gridlock, especially when Kelly Axe changed shifts and/or when the glass plant shift change took place. Both ends of the city poured traffic right into downtown along with all these routes. As a result, city leaders decided that something needed to be done to deal with the traffic congestion. That's actually a view of Lee Street, and it's a little bit later. It's in the 1940s after improvements were made, but you still get an idea. That's Lee Street then, that's Lee Street now. And the bottom slide, you can see that actually all those buildings you see in the foreground still survive. Some of them have been altered. The Clay Center is just on the other side where you can see a guy walking with a stroller on the right in the modern image. The cupola you see in the background in the top photo is the Capitol Annex, and it was replaced by what today is a Huntington Banks building, originally National Bank of Commerce. City planners, city engineers, the mayor, city council got together, and because we were in the midst of the Depression, there was the possibility for federal funding to help improve the traffic situation. As a result, a plan was devised to come up with a number of improvements that would speed traffic through Charleston on improved multi-lane roads. And we often think of the boulevard as being kind of a standalone 4-lane, 4.5-mile long boulevard that ends at Patrick Street and then ends upstream at the 35th Street Bridge now. But it was actually envisioned originally and eventually executed as part of this larger scheme to improve traffic through the city, which included an expressway, which today is 7th Avenue, from Dunbar to Patrick Street. The 4-lane that you travel on today was planned at the same time the boulevard was planned. On the other end, an expressway was planned and built from Charleston to Malden, which became the new Route 60, and then later it was extended to Bell, and now it goes all the way to Sheelian and the Sheelian Bridge in recent years. Then in the city, the improvements were to build Canal Boulevard from Canal Street and span the Elk River with a 500-foot girder span structure, which, according to the engineer who designed it and supervised it, was the longest girder span bridge in the world at the time. Believe it or not, 500 feet, which is not that long by modern standards, but I suppose girder spans were fairly new at the time, probably. Now that is Canal Street at the time. It was really just a meandering country lane. Must have been very beautiful. A lot of trees along it, beautiful homes along the road. It also had been the old James River and Canal Turnpike through town. So it was a very old route. The slide on the right, upper right, is on the west side, and that's what Canal Street looked like, just about, be a little bit below Magic Island today. The funding for those improvements consisted of part Public Works Administration funding. Because of the New Deal, there was federal money available matching federal funds. The city also passed by an overwhelming margin of 10-to-1 a levy, a bond that paid for roughly half, I think 45 to 50% of the improvements. And if you think about when this occurred, this was in the midst of the Depression, when very few people had funds and cities usually didn't have much money. So for the city leaders to approve and then the voters to overwhelmingly approve these projects was a pretty progressive idea. And of course it created jobs in the city. But it also created the modern Charleston that we all know today with the boulevard, the 2 bypasses, and thrown in for good measure was a municipal auditorium as part of that WPA package. And all those improvements, in addition to the Southside Bridge. Those were all part funded with the PWA local partnership. If you notice on the Southside Bridge, I put a little airplane down there. That was a last-minute addition. I put that on there to remind myself that in 1948, General Chuck Yeager was in town. He was here promoting some boat races on the Kanawha River. And on his way out of Charleston from Kanawha Airport back to what was in Wright Field or Wright Air Force Base in Dayton, he passed under the Southside Bridge going about 500 miles an hour and just kept on going to Dayton. He was interviewed about 3 years ago, I think in the Gazette, maybe the Daily Mail, about this. It's become a legendary story. Some people say that he went under 2 or 3 other bridges, including Patrick Street, and he said no. He passed under this one. What he had intended to do was just look at the Capitol because he thought it was so beautiful, and he saw the Southside Bridge there and he couldn't resist. So he flew under the Southside Bridge. It takes a lot of nerve to do that. Okay, we also moved some houses during construction of the boulevard. The Tuckers aren't here today, are they? Last time, Jonathan Tucker and his mother, who their family live in this house now, and their descendants from the Dollys were here, but I wish they'd come tonight because I didn't get to this last time. This is the Curtis Dolly house, which stood on Kanawha Street. At one point on Kanawha Street, there were houses on both sides of the road. There were houses right on the riverbank, and the Dolly house was one that sat right on the riverbank. It was moved during the expansion of the boulevard. Same basic idea, put on a barge and floated upstream to Kanawha City, to Kanawha Avenue, where it stands today, and that's the Dolly house in the lower left right there. And that's it on Canal Street, or yeah, what was in Canal Street at the top. Life magazine covered it in 1939. And at the lower left, you can see a couple of gate posts. In front of the Dolly house is one gate post that I used to pass by riding my bike, and the gate post stuck out in my mind as something unusual and unique, and I never knew exactly why, but it just didn't look like it belonged there, and it looked very old. And I learned from the Tuckers later on that those gate posts, they used to have two of them. Someone stole one years ago. But those gate posts used to be in front of the old Capitol on Capitol Street, the 1885 Capitol. And those are the two gate posts at the bottom there when they were in front of the Capitol. You'll find other recycled things in a little bit. The Depression era also, as a result of a recently enacted federal law creating public housing in the United States, 1939 and 1940, Charleston got the first two public housing projects that were authorized and paid for in part by a New Deal project through the WPA. And on the left is Washington Manor, which sits along the banks of the Elk River north of downtown in what used to be called the Triangle District. And Little Page Terrace on the west side, which still stands. Both of them are still there, but they've changed quite a bit in recent years. The idea in the 1940s through the 1960s and even into the 70s was that public housing would consist of rather sterile, austere apartments, high-rises, and/or townhouse type of housing. A few years ago, we all came to a realization, and planners came to a realization, that's not the way to actually have people live together in harmony. And the crime rates, problems in the projects were so overwhelming. Now, new housing projects are being built, and the old ones, Washington Manor and Little Page included, are being redone, and a lot of the old original units have been torn down, and they're being replaced with modern single-family units that are much more friendly to the occupants. And remarkably, crime has gone down in many public housing projects as a result. Now, because I chose a very dark font, you cannot read the question, but I had a question up there that at the top of the page that says, is the 1500 block of Virginia Street the longest block in the world? How many of you have heard that? Of course, we all have, right? And my answer to that question is maybe. No one has disputed it. And in the United States, we always, I always say this to my students, we tend to claim the biggest, best, first of a lot of things because no one contests us and says that we don't have the biggest, best, and the first. In this case, however, I've actually seen forums on the web. The internet is a great resource, but sometimes it can breed crazy stuff. Someone has actually posted on a forum probably 10 or 12 years ago this very same question. And there is a string of responses you would not believe about is Virginia Street or these blocks in Charleston the longest blocks in the world. People have weighed in because there is a city in the outback in Australia that has the longest road in the world or something, and they're claiming they may have the longest block, but that's not really a city like Charleston is. So no one has disputed our claim that we have the longest, actually I would say we have the 4 longest blocks in the world. And here's the reason we have those very, very long 1500 blocks of Canal Boulevard, Virginia Street, Warrior Street, and Lee Street, as well as 1/2 of Washington Street. The south side of Washington Street in the 1500 block also does not have any cross streets in it. The reason that those blocks were never divided with intersecting streets, in the 1840s, Daniel Ruffner, who owned most of the East End, including where we are today, he owned the land that later became the 1500 blocks. He divided it among 6 children. The 3 children who got the parcels in the 1500 blocks of the streets I just mentioned were siblings, Augustus, Joel, and Elizabeth Ruffner. And Augustus's house is still there at 1506 Canal Boulevard. Joel's house is about where Carroll Terrace is. And what's left of it is in Daniel Boone Park, and it's called the Ruffner Cabin today. And it used to sit in the 1500 block. Elizabeth's house is long gone, but those three siblings, children of Daniel's, acquired that parcel. Their heirs in 1895 began to partition out those holdings for development for building lots. And if you live in the East End, you go back and look at your deed, you might have a deed that says originally you were part of the Ruffner Brothers addition. And there were several additions that were done from the 1890s up to the early 20th century in that area. When they divided their holdings, they allowed a street to be constructed on the east end of those three parcels, which became known as Elizabeth Street, named for Elizabeth Ruffner. The other end of the block is Ruffner Avenue, which was the extent of the Ruffner lands. And they did not put any streets between the two. The city apparently never insisted they do, and by 1907, that grid pattern was in place when the development of the neighborhood happened. And I don't think a block could get much longer than our 1500 blocks, because if you look at the last houses on those streets, they are 1598 and 1599. You can't get any more numbers on it unless you start doing halves and A's and B's. And there's actually one house that does do that on Courier Street, and it's now owned by the Barkeys right at the end, and it's actually 1590, it'd be 1599 and a half Courier, and it's right on the corner. Now, a local newspaper man, Saul Padlubski, some of you may remember him, he actually asked the city that very question. Are these blocks the longest blocks in the world? Because by the 1950s, we were saying that apparently. So the city came back and said that Canal Boulevard in the 1500 block is 2,313 feet long. Virginia Street is 2,280 feet long. So the blocks actually go down a little bit in size from Canal Boulevard to Virginia to Courier to Lee. One loop around Canal in Virginia is almost exactly 1 mile. It's just a little bit shy. It's about 137 feet shy of 1 mile. The average city block in the United States is 1/8 of a mile long and 1/4 mile around. So those blocks are basically 4 times longer than average. And until anyone says we don't have the longest blocks in the world, we do. That map is actually the original division of the Ruffner holdings. You really can't tell much. In the lower right-hand corner, there's a little rectangle within the parcel. That's the site of the old Ruffner Cemetery, which today is Ruffner Park. That's the 1500 block today. Elizabeth, Ruffner, no cross streets. Canal Rifleman Park, otherwise known as Ruffner Park. There's a monument to the Canal Rifleman there. And if you live in the neighborhood, you know the shortcuts to get between using driveways and alleys. There were paper alleys that, in some cases, there is an alley behind some of the houses, but it doesn't continue all the way through. There's a right-of-way, but I think most of the old right-of-way has been deeded back to the owners of the property if there was never an alley built. When the era of streetcars ends, hastened by the automobile and the internal combustion engine and the automakers who wanted to sell cars and buses, Charleston would have a landmark Greyhound station. And I always ask my students, how many of you like this style? How many of you don't? Not too many of my students like that architectural style. When I was younger, I didn't care much for it. As I got older, after it was gone, I wish we had this building back again. Our Greyhound station, some of you will remember it, was blue vitrolite with cream vitrolite. And I've never seen a photograph that does it justice. Because later on, apparently the vitrolite was falling off. Vitrolite is glass, or Carrera glass is another name for it. Because the whole thing was actually covered in metal siding in its last years, which didn't do the building justice at all. But that's our Greyhound station on Summer Street. It was demolished in about 1982 to make way for, guess what, the Transit Mall. Interesting. You tear down a bus station to build essentially a bus transit mall. The station you see in the upper right is the Columbia, South Carolina Greyhound station, designed by the same Greyhound architect who was from Charleston. George Brown designed about 60 Greyhound stations in this streamlined style. Each one was different, but each one reflected that Greyhound streamlined motif. And the Columbia station still exists, and it's the closest I could find to replicating what ours look like in terms of the color scheme. A lot of neon as well. The first airport in Charleston was in Institute. In 1930, actually earlier than that, in the 1920s, Charleston needed an airport, aside from landing seaplanes on Kanawha River. We needed an airport, and the only available piece of flat ground to allow an airport to be built was about 6 miles downstream at Institute, right next between West Virginia State and what would later become the synthetic rubber plant, Union Carbide plant. Works Field was the primary airport for Charleston in the Kanawha Valley from 1930 to 1942. What I've read, the city did not have the money to actually run the airport, so it was run and operated by a group of businessmen, very civic-minded businessmen, and obviously aviation fans who kept Works Field going. Charleston had commercial air service, but in 1942, when the government decided to build the synthetic rubber plant on the adjoining parcel of land, it cut off the approach to Works Field, and airlines would no longer fly in because of the safety problems, the safety hazards. If you look up there, the Works Field hangar, I've been told, and it looks like it, that Works Field hangar was moved from Works Field to South Charleston. It now sits off of Route 60 in South Charleston, and if you can see that inset photo, it's a green building that most recently has had a for rent or for sale sign on it. It's right off where the old carbide plant used to be in South Charleston. With the city being left high and dry without air service, we also didn't have air mail in West Virginia for the longest time. Part of the reasons we didn't have an adequate airfield for the regular airmail flights. In 1944, bonds were sold to build an airport. The coonskin plan was adopted, and that was to level 3 mountaintops and fill them in on Coonskin Ridge, which today is where Yeager Airport is. And that project, which was a fantastic public works project, moved millions of pounds of yards, I should say, of earth and rock, 2 million pounds of explosives, and the end result was Kanawha Airport, which later was renamed Yeager in the 80s for General Yeager. I don't think he flew under any bridges when he came back for the dedication. That's Yeager from the air. I love to fly into Yeager with people who've never flown in here because they're not sure where they're going. I was looking around, all they see are hilltops, and then suddenly they touch down gently. You can almost make out where the 3 hills were. In the background, there's obviously one where the runway is, and I think on the left and probably on the right, and everything was filled in between. A pretty remarkable feat of engineering, but it also shows how difficult it is to build things here because of our terrain, from roads to airports. I want to look at the African-American heritage of Charleston for a minute. And the Triangle District, which I alluded to earlier, was the area located roughly north and west of downtown, Capitol Street. And that area was typically bordering the railroad. It was considered to be kind of the low-rent district for the area. Warehouses, manufacturing facilities, rail yards, a lot of steam, a lot of ash, a lot of cinders, and naturally it became the area where a lot of poor folks lived, African Americans and whites. And the Triangle, during the urban renewal period of the 1950s and 60s, it was labeled as being blighted by the federal description of blighted, which meant that this area could get federal money to tear down virtually everything that was there and redevelop the land with private development. And the legacy of that has left some pretty bitter feelings in the African American community, because a lot of folks lost their homes as a result, even though some of those homes were substandard, but it was still home to a lot of folks in this area. One of the centers of African American culture was the Ferguson Hotel, which stood until the 1960s, when it was replaced by the Heart of Town Motor Inn, the modern, ultra-modern Motor Inn, which today is the Fairfield and the Best Western. I think it's actually both of them. I looked at a picture of the modern Fairfield, which is on the right, and the Best Western, which I think is on the left, and I believe what happened is they just tore down the middle section and then added a little bit on the Best Western. If you're ever there, you can see it. It's at the corner of Dickinson and Washington, right off the Leon Sullivan exit ramp to Charleston. The Ferguson Hotel was a lively spot. It was a hotel, there was a cafe, there was a movie theater, there was a number of shops, restaurants, and African American entertainers, when they came through this area, they often stayed at the Ferguson, including people I think like Duke Ellington, Count Basie, some very important entertainers knew that they could get a meal and stay in the Ferguson because it catered to African Americans. It was an African American establishment. And also, I've read that entertainers traveling from the East Coast to the Midwest to shows knew that they could stop here, and they would, and that's obviously why people like Duke Ellington would come and stay. Garnet High School is back in the background. You can barely see it above the banner back there, the facade that you see. That was the Charleston's Black High School from about the turn of the century until desegregation in the early 1950s. The building still stands. It's still used as an educational facility, and it's a very historic building. It was within a block of the Ferguson and adjoined what was known as the block, which was an area of commercial establishments in the African American community. I've highlighted what I think is a triangle. I've never actually seen a real view. If anyone knows exactly where it was, but it was a triangle-shaped wedge of land north of Capitol Street down to Elk River. I think it's roughly there, but it may also continue on to the mouth of Elk, because that whole area all the way down to where the Civic Center is now was turned blighted at one point, and a lot of stuff was demolished as a result of urban renewal. In 1959, right on the banks of the Elk River, we get the Charleston Civic Center. My students laugh when they see this slide. That was the Civic Center? I went to some great concerts in that place. Laugh too loud. Built in 1959, you can still see a little piece of the roof from the old original Civic Center. It was improved in the 1970s and upgraded, and now we're talking about another upgrade to bring it up to modern convention center standards. This is a little-known story about segregation in Charleston. There's not a lot that's been written, or that I've found at least, about the era of segregation, but in 1959, the Milwaukee Lakers had a game here, and in those days, the NBA went on the road and played regular season games often, so they could drum up audiences. And not too many African Americans played in the NBA yet. The Milwaukee Lakers had 3 blacks on the team, including Elgin Baylor, who was a rookie sensation, and anybody who follows basketball knows who I'm talking about. He later played with Jerry West. At the time, he played with Hot Rod Hundley, who played for the Lakers. The Lakers played a game here in Charleston against the Cincinnati Royals, who no longer exist as a franchise, but Oscar Robertson later played for the Royals. Not yet. He would come the next year, I think. But it was his rookie year. Baylor refused to play in that game, which was a regular season game. It was one of the first things to be held in the new Charleston Civic Center in the winter of 1959. Baylor refused to play because the Canal Hotel would not allow him and the 2 other black players on the Lakers to actually stay at the hotel. In a show of solidarity, the entire Lakers team chose not to stay at the Canal, all the white players, and they all stayed at Edna's tourist home on Lewis Street in the heart of the African American district of the city. Baylor, people tried to convince Baylor to play, including Hot Rod himself, who was from Charleston, as most of you certainly know. But he refused to do it, and he said that he would never play in a place that would not allow him to stay with his white teammates. He also had trouble getting a good meal, and he recounts the story in newspaper articles. The organization that sponsored the game was the Charleston American Business Club. They lost money because of the low attendance, mainly because Baylor didn't play. They filed a protest with the NBA and the Lakers both, and neither protest went anywhere. Neither the NBA nor the Lakers would touch the idea of segregation that was experienced. Now, in 1960, within a year of that incident, a little more than a year, in April 1960, students from my institution, West Virginia State, held a sit-in at the lunch counter at the Diamond to integrate the lunch counter. And their efforts met with success. A month later, the Diamond integrated its dining facilities, and owing in great measure to the idea of a sit-in, which was very popular around the country after the Greensboro sit-in. Of course, the Diamond was an iconic department store on Capitol Street. Now, if we look back over the late 20th century, what happened to Charleston to lead to this population decrease and this mass exodus from the city? There are several factors. Deindustrialization that I mentioned, the factories closing, mine mechanization, the hillbilly highway, which in those days went up to the Great Lakes in the Midwest and the Northeast. Now it goes down to Charlotte and North Carolina. A lot of people left in search of jobs. Urban renewal wiped out large sections of the city, and the interstates came through and also did damage to neighborhoods in the city. Plus, we were in a period of people moving to the suburbs as well. The outlying area, once the interstate was complete, I-64, people began flocking to Taze Valley and Cross Lanes area, and it became a commuter suburb. Also, we were dealing with suburban shopping centers later on. People in cities built malls outside of the main downtown. Southridge had not happened yet, or Dudley Farms, that would come along in the 1990s. Urban renewal, Charleston has had 4 major urban renewal projects over the last 50 years. The first one in the state of West Virginia was the one that took out the oldest part of the city, and that's that 3-block area from Canal Boulevard to Virginia Street, bordered by Capitol, Summers, and all the way down to Court Street. The only building left standing was City Hall, which you see in the left-hand corner, that little dark splotch is City Hall. And it was redeveloped. The idea is that the government would pay for the old buildings to be demolished, and then private developers would move in and redevelop the parcels. And that would give rise to the Charleston House, Holiday Inn, which is now a Ramada, I think, and what's next door to that? A parking garage, and Chase Bank, thank you, yeah, that's right. The old Charleston National Tower. The Triangle District was redeveloped, as I mentioned, as well. Government Square, which later became the site of Town Center Mall and the federal courthouse. And then the East End, Plaza East Shopping Center, and the site of Power Park also was paid for in part with urban renewal funds. Charleston and many other cities, as a result of this mass exodus to suburbia in the 1950s and 60s, Charleston downtown, Capitol Street, tried to make storefronts look like they were suburban shopping strip malls. Cities all over the country did that. They put these inappropriate metal facades on buildings, usually covering only the first floor. And I show you what Capitol Street looked like at the top, and I blocked out the upper floors of the buildings on Capitol. But that's the 100 block of Capitol Street. There's Silver Brand, you might remember. Moore's is just down on the left. But try as we might to keep shoppers downtown, America's taste changed and people moved out to the suburban areas and to the malls. The Interstate Highway Act was passed in the late 50s. Charleston would begin building its interstate system through the city, and that was what separated Charleston from a lot of other cities in West Virginia. Huntington, Morgantown, Fairmont, Parkersburg, and many others chose not to have the interstate come right through the city, but to go around the city. And while it preserved the city and the fabric of the city, it also led to some economic problems, especially in Huntington. If you know Huntington, Huntington suffered for 30 years with a lack of downtown development, mainly as a result of the interstate going around the city and having to drive 4 or 5 miles to get into the city. People just bypass you. Charleston elected to have it come right smack dab through Charleston, and as a result, we get tens of thousands of cars every day passing by, and some of them stop. Town Center, I'll wrap up on this. Town Center, city officials had a choice. There were plans to build a mall out where eventually Southridge was built, Dudley Farms. There was a competing plan to build a mall in Charleston, not far from downtown. Ultimately, the decision was made to actually put Town Center Mall in the city, only a couple blocks from the old core central business district, which probably saved downtown Charleston. It certainly saved Capitol Street from utter economic devastation. Even though it did go through hard times, those of you who remember when the mall was built, Capitol Street was a veritable ghost strip. Everybody moved to the mall or closed their business pretty much. That shift changed 100 years of shopping traditions in town, but it kept a bulk of people, thousands of people in town shopping at the mall. 30 years later, it's very interesting. If you look at what's happened at Town Center Mall, it has changed. Nothing is ever static in the business world or in cities. And what you see, this trend is being played out across the country. Malls are becoming mixed-use facilities now. Big box retailers don't locate in malls so much anymore. You might remember when Montgomery Ward's closed, as one of the original anchors in the mall, we could not attract another retailer. Dillard's was flirted with, but they wanted all kinds of benefits and tax breaks. The end result is that Brick Street Insurance put their corporate headquarters on a corner of the mall to bring people into the mall, but it's not a shopping destination. It just puts bodies in the mall so they can shop at the existing stores. A lot of malls around the country, when they're abandoned, they become corporate headquarters. Others have become educational facilities. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to Town Center in the next 30 years. I dare say it will change. And there are other offices now that are being housed in the mall as well. Capitol Street, while it went through some hard times, Charleston Renaissance that was created to try to revitalize Capitol Street after the mall was built, they came up with a progressive idea that any new property owners on Capitol Street or new businesses that came into Capitol Street had to rehabilitate the facades of the buildings that they occupied on Capitol. So in the 1980s through the 1990s, and until not too many years ago, the last building was rehabbed, I think, on Capitol. We went from the 1960s fake metal facades and a lot of inappropriate signs to what we have today on Capitol Street, and that is the village appearance with the trees, which as far as I know, we never had trees historically in downtown Charleston on the street, but they are a very friendly addition to the city, and they keep the temperature down in the summer, about 10 degrees cooler on Capitol Street. Although some of them are sycamores, which, has anybody noticed that? We have sycamores planted as street trees, which sycamores get pretty big. I'm not sure we're supposed to have sycamores. Now I'll just close out. I won't say much about these. Many of you remember this. I used to hate this building when I was a kid, and then I grew to love it, and it disappeared. For Bob Evans, remember the short-lived Bob Evans that was there until a few years ago? And now it's where Brick Street Insurance is. There was talk of actually moving it, but moving it for Bob Evans. Yeah, the mall was actually behind it, and the mall didn't demolish the building. It was Bob Evans that did it in. There are remnants of all kinds of historic buildings around Charleston. The old Capitol, after it burned, bits and pieces of the Capitol were taken and put in various places. I showed you the gateposts. This storage building, which is off Central Avenue on the west side, apparently has stones from the old Capitol in it. You can see that course of stone above the doors on the left. You can barely make it out, but the old Humphreys Methodist Church, which today is Canaan Methodist, on the west side, right next to Kroger's on Rome Street, maybe, has lampposts from the old Capitol. You can see two of them there. Wilson Funeral Home, which is almost across the street, one block over, has lampposts from the old Capitol in front. And on the campus of UC, and also in Triangle Park, Russ, I didn't have a picture of that yet, but there are capitals from the old Capitol Annex. The top of the Capitol is in Triangle Park, and bits and pieces of parts of the old Capitol Annex is on the UC campus. The old Baptist Temple, which stood where Kinko's is today, was demolished, and a new church was built in 1927 at Morris and Courier Street. The stone from the old Baptist Temple was recycled, and it is now part of a home that stands on Woodward Drive in North Charleston. And I visited a few years ago, and the stones have an interesting red sandstone appearance, and some of the stained glass is actually still in that little house. And then finally, on the west side, I've done a lot of work at Glenwood. Things that aren't there anymore at Glenwood. The house is still there, in addition to the slave quarters behind Glenwood, right across the street from Stonewall Jackson Middle School. But folks that are old enough, or of a certain age, I should say, might remember the gateposts for Glenwood, which straddled Park Avenue until the late 1950s, and they disappeared, probably part of someone's basement foundation or something. There was also a spring house that was a local landmark, which is today about the corner of Stonewall Jackson Middle School. And I'll close out with this. Anybody remember those tearjerkers? Phantom 309 and Teddy Bear? Red Sovine? He was a Charleston native, grew up on the west side. I looked him up in the census, and his family lived on Russell Street. He left this area as a young man, went to Louisiana, where Hank Williams got him a break on the Louisiana Hayride show, and Sovine eventually had a number of hits. His biggest one was shortly before he died, 1976, Teddy Bear, and he died in Nashville not too many years later. He's in the West Virginia Music Hall of Fame, and he has a beautiful baritone voice, if you've ever heard him, and he'll bring a tear to your eye, regardless of what he's singing, because that voice, especially these ballads, he did a number of trucker ballads, which a lot of young folks listened to that during the CD craze of the 1970s. And that's Charleston today. Oh, and I'll close since it is the holiday season. And that is actually, that's on Virginia Street. That's in front of the old Courier House at 1308 Virginia Street, which now is a parking lot for the Eye and Ear Clinic. But it looks like a Courier and Eye's print. Thank you very much. Any questions? Jim Crow? Yeah. Yes, we had Jim Crow. It's an interesting history, and I won't go into a lot of detail here, but people don't realize that West Virginia became unless you study the subject, but my students could give this lecture. We've got a bunch of students over there. By the 1870s, Charleston went from being a Republican Northern Union state to being a Southern Democrat-controlled state that practiced separation of the races. And interestingly, Charleston's history in the African American community it's not as severe as in the Deep South. And in fact, a lot of black workers came to West Virginia to work in the coal mines and on the railroads because they could make more money here, and they felt they were treated better in West Virginia, even though we practiced separate but equal until desegregation in the 1950s. And while we were a Southern state, we were not as hardcore Southern and racist, but there were certainly a lot of racist tensions in West Virginia, and there was a bombing at Bluefield State College during the era of desegregation, and yeah, there's not a lot written about it that I've been able to find outside the African American community. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Why or what is Kanawha City?
Why or what?
Why or what is Kanawha City? I'm not from here.
Okay.
Why is there a Kanawha City? And
The name, I'm not really sure the origin of the name, other than I've seen a plan for, Kanawha City is the upper south side of Charleston. That's the best way to describe it, I guess, right? Above where the University of Charleston is, that area is South Ruffner. Don't tell people who live in South Ruffner they live in Kanawha City. I learned that a long time ago. It's not the same area. Kanawha City is farther upstream, and it originally was envisioned, I think, as a separate incorporated area, which never really incorporated. It had been farmland traditionally, really, until the glass plants were constructed, and then it started to become a residential and kind of a mixed neighborhood.
so it wasn't the reverse of being incorporated into Charleston. It was planned to be unincorporated.
That right, and then it became part of Charleston. Yeah, as the city expanded, filled in between the two plants. Anyone know any more? Russ, do you have any more details? You're a resident of that area.
The bridge, the original Canal City
That's a good
Bridge was
point.
built in 1915, I think.
And that really opened that area up to development too. I failed to mention the old bridge, which was imploded in the 1970s in favor of the new. It's been there almost 40 years now. The new 35th Street Bridge. Good point. Yeah, and bridges played a big role in opening this area up. Patrick Street Bridge and the lower end by the plant, the axe plant, and then the upper bridge, and of course Southside Bridge opened up South Hills and connected it to downtown when it was built in the 1890s. Anyone else? Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.